what happens when you have evil companions and evil advisors around you. Look what happened even towards the end of the era of Banu al-Abbas. When you look at the era, at the end of the era of the authority of the Abbasids or the Banu al-Abbas, that this was the era of the spread of the empire of the Mongols that came out of Central Asia, and then they spread towards the east into China, and they took the whole of China. And then they moved south, and they moved to the west, and they headed towards the Arabian Peninsula, even though they didn't reach, of course, the Jazeera, but they reached, the lands of what is modern-day northern parts of India and northern parts of modern-day Pakistan, then into Afghanistan and the northern parts of that, and then they moved into what is modern-day Persia or Iran, and then into Iraq, and into Syria, and into Sham, and into the southern steppes of Russia, and Russia itself. Then they moved across into Europe, into Hungary, and they were the most murderous of individuals. And the whole idea was that they would enter, they would conquer, and that they would cause such bloodshed and killing that their word would spread thousands of miles. So even before the Mongols would arrive, the people would surrender. This was the idea. So they would rape and pillage and murder and kill. So when we look towards the era of the end of Banu al-Abbas, the Abbasi rulership and caliphate, that he mentions that, you look at the likes of Ibn al-Alqami and Tusi. He mentions these, so he doesn't actually mention what they did. But one of them is Ibn al-Alqami, and the other one is At-Tusi. As for al-Alqami, even though he doesn't mention, I think he is worthy of a mention because of his khubth and his wickedness and his treachery and his nifaq and his hypocrisy. This Mu'ayyid ad-Din, even the name does not suit him. Mu'ayyid ad-Din does not suit him. He's not any Mu'ayyid of any deen. He is an individual. His name was Mu'ayyid ad-Din al-Alqami. He died in the Christian era, 1258. So around about after the 6th century in the Hijri calendar. He was a Rafidi, Shi'i, and he was given the role of a minister amongst Banu al-Abbas in the era of the Abbasi Caliph al-Musta'sim. Al-Musta'sim, who was the Caliph, he was of course a Sunni. He was a person of Sunnah, as was his father and as was his grandfather. But when it came to his rule, he became soft towards Ahlul Bid'ah. And he would give them authority, he would appoint them governors and ministers and so on. So one of the ones that he appointed as a minister was this Al-Alqami. So he became lenient towards the Rafida. He thought, they live, so, if they're in my caliphate or if they're in my rule, I'll give them some ministership and, over Persia and over other places. So Ibn Kathir said regarding him that the minister Ibn al-Alqami worked and worked with the ruler. So he'd come close to Al-Musta'sim and he would advise him. He became a close advisor to him. And he advised him that your army, you don't need such a big army anymore. The army in that time of the Muslim Empire, Banu al-Abbas, the standing army numbered 100,000 troops, which was vastly superior than anything else at that time. 100,000 troops. I mean, if you consider the army of the United Kingdom, which is considered to be the 4th biggest in the world, is still less than 100,000 today. Right? So you can see how huge the army was. And of course the army was needed because of the fact that there was so much enmity towards Islam and the Muslims in defending their borders and bringing justice to the other lands. So his standing army began at the death of his father, Musta'sim's father. It was 100,000, and his father's name was Al-Mustansir. So in the time of Al-Mustansir, or towards the end of his life, as Ibn Kathir has mentioned, Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, that his standing army was 100,000 troops. Then Al-Alqami would go to the Caliph and say, you don't need 100,000. It's a waste of wealth. Reduce it down. So he eventually went to him and told him to reduce it down by 10,000. And that's my advice to you. We can use the wealth elsewhere. So he reduced it down by 10, then another 10. Then he advised him that they don't need all of this equipment that they have. So then they took away from them their weaponry and their equipment, because they said that we are so powerful and strong that no one can overcome us. This Alqami at the same time had entered into negotiations with the grandson of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, of course, the founder of the Mongol Empire. And, of course, if you know anything about the Mongol Empire of that time, as we mentioned, the 11th century, or the 12th century really, and towards the end of the 11th, or the 13th century rather, towards the end of the 12th, that they were the most powerful force in terms of just their brutality. They did the same wherever they went. They didn't single out the Muslims. They did the same in China. They would go to a city and they would kill every man, woman and child, and then they would leave one alive and they would send him to the next village. And what would they do? They would surrender even before they arrived. But they would kill people in their hundreds and thousands. Hundreds and thousands would get killed. Right? And they would threaten them with rape and pillage and so on. Such that in some of the empires of the Qi empires or the Chinese empires, that they would take their, because the Chinese had their own way and religion and ways of doing things, and they were behind huge fortresses and castles. So what they would do is that they would line up their virgins on the top of the castle wall before the Mongols could come in, and they would just jump off the wall. It's recorded by some historians amongst the Chinese that 17,000 virgins in one day jumped off the highest peak in one of the villages or one of the fortresses that was surrounded by the Mongols. So Mongols had certain ways and things that they used to do things. So they used to sometimes, even the way that they used to come in with huge fear. None of them, by the way, walked. The Mongols would not walk. They would always fight on horseback. So most armies, of course, you have foot soldiers, and you have those that are on horseback or camelback. The Mongols, no. All of them were upon horses that were referred to as ponies. I mean, we think of ponies as baby horses, but these were extremely fast steeds. You know, they could travel for a month, and they would only require a few hours rest a day. Very lean horses, and they trained them just for the purpose. They were master archers. They said that when Genghis Khan first came towards the east, he took an army towards the eastern empire of the Islamic world, and when the Muslims looked out upon him and upon his army, that his front line alone was 15 miles wide. We're not talking about depth. So now you're looking at them coming towards you. The length of the army across in front of your sight of vision is 15 miles wide. Every single soldier is on horseback. Depth, tens of thousands in depth. This Al-Alqami, by the time of the era of the grandson of Genghis Khan, Halaku, who the Westerners refer to as Hilugu, by his time, of course, the Mongols had conquered, because of the children and the grandchildren of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was the founder of the empire, that they had spread into China, parts of India, into Russia, and into whatever surrounded them. And there were people who never lived in houses. They never went into towns and took castles and mansions and palaces to live in them. They never did that. You know, people like Genghis Khan himself and his children after him, who became the leaders, even if they conquered towns and villages, they would see the palaces and they would leave them. It is reported about Genghis Khan himself, when he entered into some of the huge palaces in China, he walked in, and that was the first time they ever saw him afraid, because he couldn't see how that roof is not falling on his head. And he refused to live in them. And his grandchildren refused to live in them. They put their tents near rivers and lakes. Even when they became the most powerful force in the world at their time, they would still not live in palaces or houses or buildings or mansions of the lands that they conquered. They would take their materials and their tents and their leather skins, and they would set up their encampment by water. That's all they would do. And then they would move on. And they lasted like that for decades, several decades, and more than that. So the Mongols were a feared force. So now, what do the Muslims need to do in response? They need to strengthen their armies. So what did this Ibn al-Alqami do? He made a deal with Halaku. He said to him, as Ibn Kathir has mentioned, also Ibn Taymiyyah and others, because this was the era of Ibn Kathir and Ibn Taymiyyah. The Mongols were active in the time of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah took a force against them. He wouldn't surrender to them. So these, or we refer to them sometimes as the Tartars or the Tatar. Right? In the books of Ibn Kathir and Ibn Taymiyyah, they refer to as Tatar or the Tartars. Even in the writings of the Chinese who have written the most about it, and also, I mean, the three groups of people who have written most about the Mongols are the Chinese, the Muslim writers like Ibn Kathir and those similar to him, and also some of the Christians when they reached Europe. And all of them, in fact, if you compare the writings, it's very similar what they're saying about these people. That they were, the Christians thought that this is Juj wa Majuj coming out. They thought this is Gog and Magog that has been written in the Bible. They've come out of the mountain and they're going to kill and slaughter. They actually gave the hukm that this is what they are. So, and you can imagine how they reached that level. So Halaku, Al-Alqami went, this Rafidi, and this is the point that Shaykh al-Fawzan is making. Look at Ahlul Bid'ah. That they come to the Muslim rulers and they seek authority. So, because of the leniency of some of the Muslim rulers, they may gain authority. And then behind their backs, they are treacherous towards Islam and the Muslimin and the Muslim rulers. So this Al-Alqami, Mu'ayyiduddin, that he went to Halaku and he said that I will work with you because I have power as a minister. And what I will do is I'll reduce the force that is going to defend the Islamic lands. And what I request of you is that you kill the caliph and you give me some authority. That's all I ask. So he agreed. Al-Alqami. There was another one, as Shaykh Fawzan has mentioned, At-Tusi. He did the same thing. But At-Tusi wasn't a minister. He was just a very influential person in society. But we'll come to Tusi in a minute. So anyway, the point I was making was that the 100,000 troops, Ibn Kathir mentions the number 100,000. That the army on that side, Allahu A'lam what it was in the Maghrib. We're talking about on the Baghdad side, in the region from Baghdad towards the east. Allahu A'lam how many tens and thousands there were towards the Western Empire of the Islamic State. And of course there were other rulers that were present and they were vying for power, but it was in general, ulama and mashayikh and fuqaha were present. And even though Ahlul Bidah did have a handhold and they were powerful, but nevertheless, they were Muslim lands all the way across into Spain with different entities and different empires. But the largest of them was the Banu al-Abbas, the Abbasi Empire. So he went to the ruler, reduced it eventually from 10,000, 100,000 down to 10,000. Then the 10,000, he convinced the ruler to reduce their stipend or their salaries, to reduce it down so they became almost in a state of poverty. Those soldiers now can't even feed their families. And it was recorded by the Mufassirin and the scholars of history that those 10,000 that remained, that they resorted to begging in the marketplaces to live. This is the army of the Muslims now. There was a time in between the 100,000 reducing down to 10,000 that Al-Alqami, he took a force of 10,000 from the Khalifa. And he said, I'll take a force and I'll make sure that side is defended. When he took the force, this Alqami and those who were with him from the Mubtadi'ah and the Rafida, that they took 100,000, he took the best, the most highly trained of the 100,000, he took 10,000 because that was that side of the land that they wanted protecting. When he took them, after taking them, after a period of time, he relinquished all of them from their duties and sent them home. He said, we don't need an army like you anymore. The 10,000 that is remaining, that is enough. So eventually it dwindled down to 10,000. So he struck his deal and he fulfilled his part of the bargain. He fulfilled his part of the bargain. So Al-Alqami was working with, Helugu Khan, the Mongol or the Tatar leader, to weaken the Muslims. And when they eventually came, he gave the order to the region that he was controlling that you are not to defend yourselves against the attack of the Mongols or the Tatar. All right. In reality, actually, the Mongols and the Tatar are two different tribes. But they're all referred to as Tatar, and sometimes they're always referred to as Mongols. But technically, they're two different tribes, but they all came under the rulership of Genghis Khan, who himself was a Mongol. All right. So he forbade the people from opposing them. He was also linked to this Nasruddin al-Tusi. And this is the other one that Shaykh al-Fawzan has mentioned. What Tusi? He mentions, well, Ibn al-Alqami. What Tusi? Tusi was a Rafidi Shi'i. He became an advisor to Halaku Khan or Haligu Khan. So both of these Rafida and others from them, from Ahlul Bid'ah, they worked closely with Halaku Khan to destroy the Abbasid Caliphate. They sacked Baghdad, they plotted with Halaku, and eventually they killed the Caliph. Because the Khalifa, who we mentioned was Musta'sim, that he sent a message to Halaku that let's negotiate terms whereby the arm, so that the fighting stops, because our people are dying. So he came from a position of weakness to negotiate with him. Who set up the meeting? The same Al-Alqami. He went, Al-Alqami and this Tusi, and they set up a meeting with Halaku Khan. So when he went to him, he said, yes, okay, I want all of the treasures, all of the gold, all of the silver, all of the wealth, the dirhams and the dinar. I want all of it. Bring it to me, and then you will not be killed, and we'll sign some agreement. This Alqami knew full well that this was a trick from Halaku. So the Khalifa had no choice. What is this to do? So he went, and a few thousand of them with him, that they brought all of the wealth and they put it in front of Halaku Khan, piles of gold and jewelry and silver. After he took the wealth, he only allowed 17 of them to come in, and Halaku ordered, and they killed him. They beheaded the Caliph, killed him, took his wealth and killed him, and killed all of his family and all of those 17 of his supporters that were with him, his court. And then they went out and they spent 40 days, or just over, or approximately 40 days, slaughtering everyone in Baghdad, up until the streets of Baghdad were flowing with the blood of men, women and children. They didn't leave. As I mentioned, this was the strategy of the Mongols, even from China. If there was resistance, or if they had some reason, even sometimes not even a reason, they would slaughter and kill, they would rape and then kill and slaughter, up until every man, woman and child that more or less was dead. Whatever was left behind were just slaves. Right, so there was no resistance because what they didn't want, the Mongols had a strategy that they wouldn't stay in a place for long. They hit one place, they don't want the next village to become strong. So they hit one city, and Baghdad was, of course, one of the biggest cities in the world at that time. We don't want the other cities to become strong whilst we're taking care of Baghdad. So let's quickly, and really a month of slaughter just to, pacify or to demolish a population is a very quick time. So that's what they did, slaughtered and killed. And they quickly moved on to the next township. What they didn't want, and one of the reasons why they did that, was because as they moved on, they didn't want the city that they have just conquered to come up behind them. So if you've slaughtered every man in that city, and every woman in that city, and the message is going out to the surrounding villages, so they're not going to come and help, and there's no one on their back, when they go to the next city. So now they've made a pathway from the heartlands of where they came from Central Asia. Anywhere that they went, they had direct pathways, because wherever they went, there was no resistance, because they'd quashed and killed the resistance. So now if they wanted to go back, because of course an army, of 70,000, 80,000, imagine the supply lines to feed an army like that. So they couldn't afford to have, people behind them that are going to, cordon them off or outflank them. So that this is what they would do. And this is what they did in the lands of Islam. And the scholars, they've written about this. Ibn Athir and others. The Crusaders, of course, did the same a few centuries later. The Crusaders did the same. Not even a few centuries later, rather. They did that before. Because the Crusades started in around about 1081. 1081 Christian era. The Mongols were a century later. But the fact is that when these people came, they came to slaughter and rape and spill the blood of the Muslims as it was flowing. And when people say, well, you would say that because, this is your historians that have written it. And that's why we always make it clear that actually when you look at the attacks of the Crusaders of Europe, who called themselves Crusaders, but they were murderers and killers, that when they entered into the Holy Lands of Sham and Jerusalem and so on, from the Christian, chroniclers and historians, as compared to the Muslim ones, you find that there's a lot of agreement. Because the Christians, that they wrote from several different angles, the Christians of Egypt, the Christians of the Western Roman Empire, the Christians of the Eastern Byzantium Empire, and also the Jews that were there, that they would all write, and the Muslim would write. And if there's one thing that they all agree upon, is the slaughter, the indiscriminate slaughter that took place at the hands of the Christians during the Crusades, and then at the hands of the Mongols, who came a while later. But nevertheless, the point being here, look what they do, Ahlul Bid'ah. What khair and what good do they bring to Islam? Nothing. So then he mentioned that they, after mentioning, if you look at what happened at the time towards the end, and the collapse of Bani al-Abbas, the Abbasi Empire, or the Caliphate, what did they do with the Khalifa al-Abbasi? What did they do to him? Look what Halukah did to him. At the request of who? Of his own minister, Bid'i, Rafidi. Then he mentioned that that these Ahlul Bid'ah, the Shia, and other than them, they agitated the Tatars, the Tatar, against the Khalifa from the east. And when they came to attack the Khalifa's own minister is coming in with the armies of the Tatar to kill the Muslims. He's with them in their ranks. Both. This At-Tusi, the Tusi, of course, At-Tusi is famous amongst the kuffar. When they started looking at the moon, the Russians named a planet after him. There's a minor planet in, far distant from the earth, and they called that planet and they called it, this is Tusi. Right? Because they raise him. Of course, the kuffar are going to raise these types of people. Rafidi, Persian, they called him, they regard him to be an astronomer. NASA named a crater on the moon after him. This At-Tusi. What did At-Tusi do? Open up the gates for the Mongol Tatar to come in and slaughter men, women and children. Tusi and Al-Alqami. So you have to pay attention, barakallahu feekum, who is raised and who is doing the raising. Of course they are going to raise the likes of At-Tusi and other than him. Barakallahu feekum. I'll just finish this paragraph and I'll stop there, inshallah, for today. But he said that that these individuals, that they opened the pathways to the enemies of Islam, the Tatar and the Mongols. They made easy for them the paths into Baghdad up until they entered into Baghdad. They destroyed it outright, absolutely demolished and annihilated Baghdad and its people, the Muslims. And they destroyed the rest of the lands of Islam. And they killed the Muslim fighters in huge numbers. Because now you've an army of 10,000 that is ill-equipped. So who's going to pick up the arms? It's the farmers and the soldiers and the traders. As soon as they come up against the Tatar slaughtered them in their hundreds of thousands, if not millions. of Muslims that they killed. And when they entered into Baghdad, of course Baghdad was a very modern city of the era. Libraries, universities, masajid, bathhouses. You know, it was a very advanced city for its era. They entered into the libraries, and it was the biggest library in the world at that time. Even today, it would be considered as one of the biggest libraries in the world. They went in, and they burned all of the books. They burned all of the books, and then they threw the remainder into the Tigris, and the river Tigris and the river Euphrates, up until they changed the color of the river itself. The river water, its color changed due to that which they did, and some say due to the blood of the Muslims. And they thought, these Ahlul Bid'ah, alongside their aiders and supporters from the enemies and the kuffar, that they thought that they had destroyed Islam itself. However, Islam is mu'ayyid, min Allahi la yuqda alayh. But Islam is aided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it cannot be destroyed. They tried. Look what they did. And you know, there's when you actually go through the story of what the Mongols did, and you look at it, and you imagine yourself at the time as these events are taking place, as the news is arriving in the cities, that they have conquered Bukhara, because they did. Samarkand, because they did. They built, you know, they went into Samarkand, they slaughtered the people, they demolished the palace and so on. That's what they did, burned it down. And they entered from that side. And imagine, you know, if you're part of that whole, you know, event that is taking place, you, your family, your village, and the Tatar are coming, and you heard what they do. What is a person supposed to do? When you have Rafida like this bringing them, Ahlul Bid'ah like this supporting them, what are you supposed to do? Because these are supposed to be individuals who are defending and protecting the lands of Islam alongside you, yet they are the ones who are aiding the enemy against you.